Welcome to Moonlit Inc. BL. A BL story written under moonlight. Let's begin. Chapter 1, The Cold Earth and the Golden Bloom. The rain in Sletopia did not wash away sins, it only turned the earth into a hungry, sucking throat of grey mud. Alden Terrell lay face down in the sludge of the outer gardens, his fingers clawing feebly at the roots of a dead willow tree. Each breath was a jagged shard of glass cutting through his lungs. The poison, a parting gift from Morgan Ingram's primary consort, was efficient. It paralyzed the limbs while keeping the mind agonizingly sharp. Above him, the palace spires glowed with the warm, mocking light of the midsummer gala. He could hear the faint strain of violins and the rhythmic thud of dancing feet. They were celebrating his absence. To the Empire, Alden was a smudge of ink on a ledger, a political discard who had served his purpose and was now being erased by the silence of the rain. "Is this it?" Alden whispered, his voice a wet rattle. His vision began to fray at the edges, the world dissolving into a hazy violet. He felt the cold seep into his marrow, the finality of a life spent in shadows, used and discarded by a husband who had never once looked him in the eye. Then, the sky died. The music from the palace stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt physical. The clouds above Sletopia didn't just part, they shattered. A tectonic roar shook the foundations of the earth, a sound that wasn't heard so much as felt in the teeth. Through the blur of his dying gaze, Alden saw a streak of impossible gold tearing through the atmosphere. It wasn't a meteor. It was a wing, vast, scaled, and shimmering with the light of 1,000 dying stars. Mygam the Protector. The Ancient One, a myth etched into the crumbling friezes of the old temples, descended. The wind from his wings cleared the rain for miles, creating a vacuum of heat that scorched the mud dry in an instant. The dragon landed, his massive claws furrowing the stone of the garden path, and shifted. In a blur of light and folding space, the mountain-sized beast condensed into the form of a man. He stood over Alden, draped in robes of living silk, his hair a river of liquid silver that defied the gravity of the mortal plane. His eyes were not human, they were glowing crucibles of molten gold. A soul so bright, Mygam's voice resonated within Alden's skull, to be extinguished in such a hollow place. Mygam knelt in the dirt, his regal presence an affront to the filth of the garden. He reached out, his hand cupping Alden's chin. The contact was electric, a jolt of pure energy that forced Alden's eyes wide. "The Empire has taken your breath, little bird," the dragon murmured, a terrifying softness in his gaze. "I shall give you mine." Mygam leaned down, his lips inches from Alden's. He didn't kiss him, he exhaled. A stream of primordial essence, thick, glowing, and smelling of ozone and ancient suns, poured from the god into the dying man. It was not a gentle healing. It was an invasion. Alden's back arched off the ground, his scream trapped in his throat as the golden heat flooded his failing lungs. The poison was not purged, it was vaporized. His blood, once sluggish and cold, began to hum with a celestial frequency. Alden's heart gave one final, desperate thud, then restarted with the force of a hammer against an anvil. As the light faded, Alden lay gasping, his skin shimmering with a faint, metallic luster. The mud beneath him had turned to glass. He looked up, the agony of death replaced by a heavy, throbbing power that felt like he was carrying a star in his chest. Mygam stood, looking down at his handiwork with a predatory tilt of his head. "Rise, Alden Terrell," the dragon commanded. "The debt is paid, the bond is forged, and the sky is watching." In the distance, the palace bells began to toll, a frantic, panicked alarm. But for the first time in his life, Alden wasn't afraid. The golden heat within him was rising, and he realized with a terrifying clarity, Sletopia was cold, and he was finally, irrevocably, on fire. Chapter 2, The Predator's Shadow. The transition from death to life felt less like an awakening and more like a forging. Alden opened his eyes to the familiar, peeling ceiling of his quarters in the low court, but the world was no longer dim. The shadows in the corners didn't look like darkness anymore, they looked like living textures. The silence of the room wasn't quiet, it was a vibrating hum that resonated in the very marrow of his bones. He tried to sit up, and a gasp tore from his throat. His chest felt as if it had been hollowed out and filled with molten lead. It was a heavy, suffocating heat that radiated from his lungs, pulsing in time with a heartbeat that sounded far too loud to be merely human. "Do not fight the weight," a voice commanded. Alden bolted upright, or tried to, but his limbs felt sluggish, weighed down by the sheer density of the power flowing through them. Leaning against the heavy oak wardrobe was a man who shouldn't have been there. He was tall, impossibly so, with a frame that seemed to exert its own gravitational pull. His silver hair fell like a waterfall of moonlight over shoulders clad in midnight silks. Those eyes, those burning crucibles of gold, fixed on Alden with a terrifying intensity. "You," Alden rasped. His voice was different, deeper, laced with a faint metallic ring. "The dragon." "I am Mygam," the man said, stepping into the weak morning light filtering through the grime-streaked window. "And you are the man who refused to die quietly. A rare quality in this stagnant age." Alden clutched his chest, his fingers digging into his thin tunic. "It burns." "Mygam, what did you do to me?" "The heat, it's too much." Mygam walked toward the bed, his movements fluid and predatory. As he drew closer, the agonizing pressure in Alden's chest began to ease, the frantic heat smoothing out into a low, manageable thrum. "I gave you my essence to keep your soul tethered to your meat," Mygam said bluntly, sitting on the edge of the cot. The small wooden frame groaned under a weight that didn't match the man's physical size. "But a mortal vessel is not designed to hold the sun. You are currently a glass jar filled with lightning. Will it kill me?" Alden asked, his breath hitching as Mygam reached out. "If I leave this room for too long?" "Yes," Mygam said, his fingers brushing the pulse point on Alden's neck. The contact sent a shock of cooling relief through Alden's body, a sensation so intense it made his toes curl. "We are now bound, Alden Terrell. My life is the anchor to yours. If your heart stops, I lose a portion of my divinity. If I stray too far, your blood will boil within your veins." Alden looked at the dragon's hand, the long, elegant fingers that held the power to level cities. He was a discarded concubine, a man who had been told his entire life that he was a burden, a mistake, a footnote in Morgan Ingram's rise to power. Now, he was the living reliquary of an ancient god. "Why?" Alden whispered, looking into those golden eyes. "You could have let me die. You are a protector of the world. Why bind yourself to this?" He gestured vaguely to his bruised body and the squalor of his room. Mygam's gaze softened, just a fraction, though the fire within them didn't dim. "Because when the poison took your breath, you didn't pray for mercy. You cursed the sky for not giving you more time to fight. I found that interesting." The dragon leaned in closer, the scent of ozone and ancient cedar filling Alden's senses. "The Empire thinks you are a ghost, Alden. They believe they have successfully buried their shame in the mud. Let them believe it for a little longer. Let the heat build." Alden felt a strange, dark spark ignite in his gut, one that had nothing to do with dragon fire and everything to do with human spite. He looked at his hands, watching as a faint, golden shimmer danced beneath his skin. "They won't recognize me," Alden said, his voice growing stronger. "No," Mygam agreed, a slow, dangerous smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "They won't. They spent years trying to extinguish you. They have no idea that all they did was provide the kindling." As Mygam's hand remained on his neck, grounding the volatile energy, Alden realized the true cost of his survival. He was no longer his own master, but he was no longer a victim. He was a tethered god in a house of porcelain men, and the first cracks were already starting to show. Chapter 3: The Ghost Returns to Court. The spring banquet was traditionally the night the Sletopia Empire paraded its opulence like a gilded corpse. The air in the great hall was thick with the scent of roasted meats, expensive lilies, and the sour undercurrent of court gossip. At the head of the long, obsidian table sat Morgan Ingram, laughing at a joke made by a high-ranking duke. He looked every bit the powerful husband, sharp-featured, arrogant, and entirely convinced of his own untouchability. To his left sat the favorite who had administered the poison, a man named Cashin, who was currently sipping wine with a triumphant smirk. They were celebrating a vacancy. Then, the heavy oak doors groaned open. The music didn't just stop, it died in a discordant screech of violins. The temperature in the hall rose 10 degrees in a single heartbeat. Alden Terrell walked in, and the court gasped as one. He was not the pale, trembling shadow they remembered. He wore robes of deep crimson and gold that seemed to catch light even in the shadows. His skin, once sallow from neglect, now possessed an ethereal, sun-kissed glow. Every step he took was measured, heavy with a new, terrifying grace. But it was the man trailing half a step behind him that froze the blood in the noble's veins. Mygam walked with his hands clasped behind his back, his silver hair bound by a simple leather cord. He wore the black uniform of a personal guard, yet no guard in the history of Sletopia had ever looked so much like a predator evaluating a room full of prey. His golden eyes swept over the assembly, and several ministers dropped their goblets in sheer, instinctive terror. "Alden?" Morgan stammered, his face draining of color. He stood so abruptly his chair screeched against the marble. You were ill," the physician said. "The physicians were mistaken," Alden interrupted. His voice carried a resonance that vibrated the crystal glasses on the table. He didn't stop until he was standing directly across from his husband. "It seems I am far more difficult to discard than you anticipated, Morgan." Cashin, trembling, tried to sneer. "You dare address the Lord with such insolence? And who is this brute you've brought into the inner sanctum?" Mygam shifted his gaze to Cashin. The air around the favorite began to shimmer with a sudden, localized heat. The wine in Cashin's cup began to steam, then bubble. "I am his shadow," Mygam said, his voice a low rumble that felt like a tectonic plate shifting. "And I would be very careful how you speak to your betters. The air in this room is quite flammable tonight." Morgan, trying to reclaim his shattered dignity, stepped around the table toward Alden. "I am your husband, Alden. You will explain yourself, and you will dismiss this guard at once." As Morgan reached out to grab Alden's arm, Mygam moved. He didn't draw a weapon, he simply stepped between them. The moment Morgan's hand came within an inch of Mygam's chest, a shockwave of golden energy erupted. It wasn't a blow, but a rejection of the Emperor's very presence. Morgan was thrown back 3 feet, his boots skidding on the polished floor. The hall plunged into a panicked murmur. "Don't touch him," Mygam hissed, his pupils slitting into vertical diamonds. The heavy air became suffocating, a golden pressure that forced the weaker courtiers to their knees. Alden looked at Morgan, seeing him clearly for the first time, not as a master or a source of fear, but as a small, hollow man playing with titles. Alden felt the golden heat in his chest flare in response to Mygam's proximity, a comforting roar of power. "I didn't come here to resume my place in your bed or your shadows, Morgan," Alden said, his eyes flashing with a momentary, draconic amber. He took a seat at the table, though no place had been set for him. The wood beneath his touch charred slightly, leaving the faint scent of cedar and smoke. "I came to watch you realize," Alden smiled, "and it was a predatory, beautiful thing, that the empire you built on my back is starting to smoke." Mygam stood behind him, a silent, celestial sentinel. The spring banquet continued, but the celebration was over. The predator had entered the cage, and for the first time, the captors were the ones who felt trapped. Chapter 4: The Weight of Godhood. The chambers of the low court were never designed to house a god, and the walls were beginning to show the strain. Fine hairline fractures snaked across the stone hearth, and the air smelled perpetually of a summer storm, sharp, metallic, and heavy with ozone. Alden sat on the floor, his breath coming in ragged hitches. He stared at his hands, watching in a trance of terror as his veins glowed with a rhythmic, molten light. The golden heat wasn't just a sensation anymore, it was an entity. It felt like a trapped bird of prey clawing at the cage of his ribs, desperate to tear through his skin and incinerate everything in sight. I can't hold it, Alden gasped, his voice cracking. As his frustration spiked, a nearby ceramic vase didn't just break, it vitrified, the clay turning to jagged glass before shattering under the sheer thermal pressure. Peace, little bird, Mygam's voice came from the shadows, cool and steady. The dragon approached, his presence alone acting as a dampener to the volatile energy. He sat behind Alden, his large, calloused hands hovering just an inch from Alden's shoulders. The heat between them was palpable, a physical wall of resistance. Your mortal mind tries to compartmentalize the power, Mygam explained, his voice vibrating against Alden's spine. You treat it as a guest you are trying to usher out. You must treat it as your own blood. It does not want to leave you, it wants to sustain you. It's too heavy, Alden choked out, a tear tracking down his cheek and evaporating into a puff of steam before it could hit the floor. I feel like I'm disappearing. Then let me be the earth, Mygam murmured. He closed the distance, pressing his palms firmly against Alden's chest and back. The contact was a revelation. It wasn't just skin on skin, it was the meeting of two celestial currents. Mygam acted as a lightning rod, drawing the excess, jagged spikes of Alden's power into his own vast, ancient reservoir. Alden slumped back against Mygam's chest, a long, shuddering sob escaping him. The relief was intoxicating. The agonizing pressure in his lungs subsided into a low, thrumming warmth that felt less like an invasion and more like a heartbeat. Better? Mygam asked. His chin rested near Alden's temple, and for a moment, the fearsome protector of Sletopia sounded almost humanly weary. Why is it so much easier when you touch me? Alden whispered, his eyes fluttering shut. He was acutely aware of the dragon's strength, the hard lines of his chest, and the way Mygam's thumb moved in a slow, unconscious circle against his collarbone. Because we are no longer two separate entities, Alden. The soul bond creates a circuit. When we touch, the essence finds its balance. Mygam's grip tightened slightly, a possessive reflex he didn't bother to hide. But there is a danger in this grounding. The more I stabilize you, the more our spirits entwine. You will begin to see what I see. You will feel the hunger of the sky. As if to prove the point, a flash of vision scorched Alden's mind. He saw the Empire from a mile up, the tiny, scurrying lives of the courtiers looking like ants beneath a golden claw. He felt Mygam's ancient, aching loneliness, and the sudden, sharp spark of protective heat the dragon felt for the man in his arms. Alden turned in the circle of Mygam's arms, looking up at the silver-haired god. The fear was still there, but it was being overtaken by a heady, dangerous attraction. He reached up, his fingers trembling as they brushed the dragon's jawline. Let them entwine, then, Alden challenged, his amber-flecked eyes defiant. I spent my life being nothing to everyone. I would rather be everything to a monster. Mygam's eyes flared, the gold swallowing the silver. For the first time, the heat in the room didn't come from the essence, but from the friction of two souls realizing they were no longer alone in the dark. Outside, the palace bells chimed the midnight hour, but inside the room, the sun was rising. Chapter 5, The Emperor's Jealousy. The royal hunt was never truly about the stags or the hawks, it was about the hierarchy of blood. Morgan Ingram rode at the head of a glittering column of noblemen, his face a mask of wounded pride. Every time he glanced back at Alden, who rode a coal-black stallion with a calm, terrifying dignity, Morgan's jaw tightened. Alden felt the malice rolling off his husband like a physical stench. But more than that, he felt the heavy, golden hum of Mygam, who moved through the underbrush on foot with the silent grace of a mountain lion. Mygam was officially his beast warden, a title Morgan had insisted upon to demean the dragon's status. Mygam had simply smiled, a look that promised a very different kind of hunt. "The thicket at the Great Ravine is where the white stag was spotted," Morgan announced, his voice carrying a jagged edge. "Alden, as my consort, you shall lead the drive. It is a position of honor." It was a death sentence. The Great Ravine was a labyrinth of crumbling limestone and treacherous drops, a place where accidents were easily arranged. As Alden guided his horse into the dense, shadowed trees, the sounds of the court faded. The air grew cold, then unnaturally still. Suddenly, a whistle pierced the canopy. From the shadows of the rocks, a dozen men emerged, not royal hunters, but mercenaries draped in the Ingram livery. They didn't carry bows for sport, they carried heavy crossbows fitted with blackened steel bolts. "Lord Morgan sends his regards," the leader spat. "He says a ghost should stay in the grave." The first bolt hissed through the air. Alden didn't have time to think. He threw his hand up, and the golden heat reacted before his mind could form the command. A shimmering wall of distorted air erupted in front of him. The bolt hit the barrier and vaporized instantly, turning into a puff of metallic ash. "Kill him," the mercenary screamed, panic coloring his voice. The forest exploded into violence. Bolts flew from all sides, but Alden was no longer a man, he was a conduit. He felt the bond with Mygam snap taut like a harp string. The dragon's power flooded his nervous system, a tidal wave of primordial fire that turned his vision into a landscape of heat and energy. "Let it out, Alden," Mygam's voice whispered in the back of his mind, dark and encouraging. "Stop trying to be small." Alden screamed, not in fear, but in release. He threw his arms wide, and the golden essence within him roared outward. It wasn't a fire that burned wood, it was a conceptual heat. The trees didn't ignite, they simply turned to dust. The limestone walls of the ravine softened like wax, the stone dripping down the cliffs in glowing ribbons. The mercenaries didn't even have time to scream. The shockwave swept through the clearing, disintegrating their weapons and tossing their bodies like leaves into the newly formed glass basin of the valley. Silence returned, broken only by the crackle of cooling stone. Alden stood in the center of a mile-wide circle of desolation. His clothes were singed, his eyes glowing with a terrifying, unblinking light. He turned to see Morgan Ingram and the rest of the hunting party cresting the ridge. Morgan pulled his horse to a violent halt, his face turning a sickly, translucent white. He looked down at the blackened wasteland, at the molten glass still glowing at Alden's feet, and at the man he had once called a weakling. Mygam emerged from the smoke behind Alden, stepping over a pile of smoldering steel. He placed a hand on Alden's shoulder, grounding the remaining energy, but his eyes remained fixed on Morgan. "The drive was successful, Lord Ingram," Mygam rumbled, his voice echoing off the scorched cliffs. "The prey has been flushed out." Alden stepped forward, his boots crunching on the vitrified earth. He looked up at Morgan, and for the first time, the Emperor saw the celestial predator hiding behind the human mask. "You missed, Morgan," Alden said, his voice a low, vibrating hum that made the horses whinny in terror. "But I don't." Morgan Ingram, the master of Sletopia, did the only thing he could do. He turned his horse and fled, the golden heat of a god breathing down his neck. Chapter 6, Forbidden Rites. The journey to the Dragon's Peak was not a climb through physical space, but a trek through the thinning veil of the world. As Alden and Mygam ascended the jagged spine of the mountains, the air grew so cold it should have frozen the breath in Alden's lungs. Instead, he felt a frantic, pressurized heat. The essence was no longer humming, it was screaming, demanding to be reunited with the source. "The peak is the hearth of the world," Mygam said, his human form flickering like a candle in a gale. "It is the only place where the vessel and the fire can become one without shattering." They reached the summit, a natural cathedral of obsidian and ice. In the center lay a pool of liquid starlight, a spring of primordial energy that mirrored the golden heat in Alden's chest. "The ritual of union," Alden whispered, his body trembling. He could feel his very atoms vibrating, his skin beginning to flake away into embers. "Tell me the truth, Mygam. Why did you really choose me? Out of all the dying things in the world, why a discarded concubine?" Mygam turned, his silver hair whipping around a face that looked more ancient than the stones beneath them. He stepped close, his hand cupping Alden's cheek. For the first time, there was no dominance in the gesture, only a raw, aching vulnerability. "I have watched this empire for eons, Alden. I have seen kings beg for power and heroes cry for glory. They are all noise." Mygam's voice cracked, a sound like a mountain breaking. "But you, when you were dying in that mud, you didn't ask for a god to save you. You reached for the sky with bloody fingers and demanded it witness your end. You were the only thing in Sletopia that was real." The honesty was more overwhelming than the heat. Alden reached out, grabbing the lapels of Mygam's robes and pulling the dragon down into a desperate, searing kiss. The world vanished. The contact triggered the final release. As they fell toward the obsidian floor, the union began. It was a consummation of both flesh and spirit. Every touch sent waves of golden light rippling through the cavern. Alden felt Mygam's memories, the birth of stars, the cooling of the earth, the crushing weight of being a lone protector, and Mygam felt Alden's, the sting of the lash, the cold of the low court, and the blossoming, fierce love for the monster who had seen his worth. They merged in a storm of gold. The heavy heat that had been a burden for weeks finally found its equilibrium. It flowed out of Alden and into Mygam, then back again in a perfect, infinite loop. "I am not your vessel anymore," Alden gasped against Mygam's lips, his eyes fully gold, glowing with the radiance of a midday sun. "No," Mygam growled, his arms locking around Alden with a grip that could crush steel. "You are my equal. My heart. My end." As the ritual peaked, the mountain itself seemed to roar in approval. The sky above the peak cleared, revealing a cosmos that pulsed in time with their shared heartbeat. When the light finally dimmed, Alden lay in Mygam's arms, his skin no longer shimmering with a frantic light, but glowing with a steady, unbreakable power. The broken mortal was gone. In his place was something new, a celestial predator who finally understood that he didn't need to fear the fire. He was the fire. And now, he had the strength to carry it back down the mountain and burn the throne that had tried to bury him. Chapter 7, The Sletopian Reckoning. The descent from the dragon's peak was not a walk, but an omen. The sky above the Sletopia Empire curdled into the color of a bruised plum, lightning dancing in the clouds without the release of thunder. Alden felt the shift before it happened. A jagged, cold void opened in the spiritual tether connecting him to the world. "Mygam," he whispered, but the name died in his throat as a network of obsidian black chains erupted from the very shadows of the mountain pass. These were not forged of iron. They were wrought from nullglass, a substance bled from the void by the Emperor's cabal of dark sorcerers. The moment the chains lashed around Alden's wrists, the golden heat in his chest didn't just dim, it recoiled. It was a sensory deprivation so violent he dropped to his knees, his connection to Mygam flickering like a dying candle. "The dragon spawn has fallen," a voice screeched. From the gloom emerged Morgan Ingram, flanked by hooded figures whose breath came out as black vapor. Morgan looked haggard, his eyes bloodshot with an obsessive, manic greed. He held a scepter topped with a pulsating, leaden stone. "You thought you were a god, Alden?" Morgan sneered, stepping over the threshold of the leaden web trap. "You are nothing but a cup. And I am going to drink every drop of what he poured into you." The sorcerers began the chant. The nullglass chains began to glow with a sickly, necrotic purple, vibrating at a frequency that tore at Alden's soul. He felt the primordial essence, the gold that had become his blood, his breath, his very identity, being sucked toward the surface of his skin. It was an agony worse than the poison, it was the feeling of being unmade. Miles away, the atmosphere above the capital shattered. Mygam had been scouting the perimeter when the bond was struck. The sensation of Alden's pain hit him like a physical blow to the heart. In an explosion of silver light and displaced air, the human mask tore away. The great golden dragon erupted into the sky, his wingspan blotting out the sun over Sletopia. He did not roar. The sound he made was a celestial vibration that shattered every window in the Imperial Palace. "Return him," the dragon's voice boomed, not through the air, but through the very bones of every living soul in the Empire. In the mountain pass, the sorcerers doubled their efforts. Alden's skin began to crack, gold light leaking out of him in jagged ribbons, drawn toward the scepter in Morgan's hand. Morgan's face was twisted in a rictus of ecstasy as he felt the first taste of divinity. "I can feel it." Morgan laughed, his voice cracking. "The sun is mine." But the dragon was coming. The clouds ignited as Mygam dove, a golden meteor aimed directly at the heart of the capital. He didn't care about the city, he didn't care about the throne. He felt Alden's light fading, and in response, the Protector became the destroyer. Buildings crumbled under the sonic pressure of his descent. The Imperial Guard fired ballistas, but the bolts turned to ash before they could touch a single scale. Mygam landed in the center of the palace courtyard, his massive talons shredding the marble. He looked toward the mountains, his eyes twin suns of pure, unadulterated fury. Inside the mountain trap, Alden heard that silent roar. He saw the flicker of Mygam's terror, not for himself, but for Alden. "I am not a cup," Alden thought, his teeth grinding as the nullglass tried to peel his soul away. "I am the fire." He stopped fighting the extraction. Instead, he pushed. He took every ounce of the golden heat, the heavy, suffocating divinity, and shoved it into the chains. The nullglass wasn't designed to hold the full, concentrated will of a dragon's heart. "What are you doing?" Morgan shrieked, seeing the scepter in his hand begin to glow white-hot. "Stop. It's too much." "You wanted the sun, Morgan," Alden rasped, his eyes turning into pits of molten gold. "Now, burn for it." The explosion of light was visible from the capital. The mountain pass vanished in a pillar of gold, and in the courtyard of the palace, Mygam reared back, sensing the sudden, violent surge of his bonded mate's power. The reckoning had begun, and Sletopia was about to learn that you cannot cage the heat of a god without turning the cage to ash. Chapter 8, The Empire in Ashes. The mountain pass did not collapse, it ceased to exist. When the light finally receded, the sorcerers were nothing but shadows etched into the scorched granite. Morgan Ingram lay on his back, his fine silks reduced to blackened rags, his hands blistered from the scepter that had melted into a useless puddle of slag. He gasped for air, but the oxygen had been burned out of the atmosphere. Alden Terrell stood in the center of the crater. He was no longer shivering. The nullglass chains had not just shattered, they had been absorbed. The black veins of the void metal now ran beneath his skin like dark marble, a permanent map of the day he refused to be unmade. You are a monster," Morgan wheezed, crawling backward as Alden approached. "No," Alden said, his voice overlapping with a draconic echo that shook the very stones. "I am the consequence." He didn't strike Morgan. He didn't need to. He simply looked toward the horizon, where the massive, golden silhouette of Mygam was banking in the sky, a living sun returning to its horizon. With a thought, Alden leaped. He didn't fall, the golden heat within him caught the air, propelling him upward in a streak of amber light. He landed on the dragon's broad, scaled brow. As his skin touched Mygam's golden hide, the heavy heat finally became weightless. The circuit was complete. "Sletopia," Mygam's voice resonated through Alden's mind, a question and a command. "Let it burn," Alden replied. "Not the people. The throne." The descent was a symphony of destruction. Mygam didn't use fire, he used his presence. As they glided over the capital, the sheer friction of their combined essence caused the Imperial Palace's spires to soften and slump like melting wax. The high walls, built on the labor of the broken, crumbled into dust. The citizens watched from the streets as the symbol of their oppression dissolved into a golden mist. There was no slaughter, only an architectural exorcism. They landed in the ruins of the throne room. The obsidian chair where Morgan had sat to pass judgment on Alden was now a jagged heap of glass. Alden stepped off Mygam's head as the dragon shifted back into his human form. Mygam stood amidst the wreckage, his silver hair glowing with the reflected light of the dying fires. He looked at Alden, and for the first time, there was no protector or concubine. There were only two predators who had found a home in each other. "The Empire is broken," Mygam said, looking at the cowering nobles who had emerged from the cellars. "They wait for a new king." Alden looked at the shattered throne, then at the sky that was finally clear of Sletopia's smog. He felt the infinite reach of the golden heat, the way it yearned for the open thermals and the untouched peaks. "Let them rule themselves," Alden said, turning his back on the ruins. He reached out and took Mygam's hand, their fingers interlacing, a bond of gold and shadow. "I spent too long in cages, Mygam. I didn't survive the dirt just to sit in a bigger one." Mygam smiled, a slow, radiant expression that held more warmth than the primordial essence. "Then where, my heart?" "Higher," Alden said. With a shared breath, they ignited. Two streaks of gold tore through the roof of the ruined palace, ascending until the screams of the court and the politics of men were nothing but a faint, receding hum. In the mud of the outer gardens, a single willow tree, once dead, began to sprout leaves of pure, shimmering gold. It was the only monument left to the man who had died there, and the god who had decided he was worth the weight of the sun. The Sletopia Empire remained, but its shadow was gone. High above, where the air was thin and the stars were bright, the dragon and his equal rode the heat of a new dawn, finally, irrevocably free.